My Gavan and Melonine, and well met indeed. I'm Archir Gallagher, and head of the modding team behind Divide and Conquer, and welcome to another Lorecast detailing at the moment the rise and unfortunate fall of the sons and children of Numenor. We left off last time with the realm of Arnor having been founded in the north of Eriador, and well indeed in almost all of Eriador to be honest, and Gondor of course in the south. And we join the tale of Arnor around the year 1300 of the Third Age, in the reign of their king Malvagil. Malvagil, son of Celebrimbor of Arthedain. And as we say at this time, the main threat to Arnor arises, and the threat, of course, is Angmar. Angmar lay just beyond Arthedain in the north, very far north of Eriador, beyond the Etten Moors and beyond the spur that leads with Mount Graham. Angmar's name itself means Iron Home, although I've not seen, I'm not sure if that's just happy coincidence or whether Tolkien intended it to be called Iron Home, but that's what it translates from in Sindarin. The land of Angmar prior to the coming of the Witch King was a land already occupied by men who didn't particularly like the peoples of Arnor. We know very, very little about these men, though, simply that they occupied Angmar. There is suggestion that orcs and men occupied it at the same time, but the most common theory I have seen is that Angmar's orcs came with the Witch King and that they were not there until he came. But there is no definitive answer on that, so I'm afraid you will just have to read into that as you see fit. But around the time of the rise of Angmar, both evil men and orcs and other fell creatures gathered in Angmar, and indeed further down and around the Misty Mountains, but it's Angmar we concern ourselves with. And the Witch King had been sent here to lead the Risen Dominion. The Witch King, of course, acting as an agent of Sauron, who above all else wants to see the destruction of the Númenóreans. Yes, he wants dominion over the whole world, but at the moment the biggest thorn in his side and the greatest embarrassment to him thus far has been the Númenóreans and their defeat of him. Although, of course, he got his comeuppance by destroying their entire island, but that is not enough. He wants their sons, their daughters, their very existence and their history erased from the face of Middle-earth, and so he sends the Witch King to do that. By the time of Malvagil's son, well, I should say that during Malvagil's reign, very little war actually takes place. It is more just skirmishes and them preparing for the wars of Angmar, and knowing that a great threat is coming. By the crowning of his son, Argaleb I, no true descendant of Isildur remained at this time in either Cardolan or Rhudaur. So Argaleb claims the kingship of all Arnor. Now this is very much ceremonial. The lands of Cardolan and Rhudaur are, whilst not completely devoid of life, they are at best tenuously linked to Arthedain, but he claims the kingship nevertheless, and Rhudaur outright resists. Cardolan does conform with Arthedain and they join together in a sort of union, but I don't believe that they fully accept him as their king. And they continue to sort of continue on as an independent section of this new sort of two-way alliance. But Rhudaur outright resists. The Dunedain of Rhudaur had become very few indeed, and the indigenous hillmen now outnumbered them significantly. And a chieftain of these hillmen had actually seized power in Rhudaur by this time, and unbeknownst to any at the moment, he was in league with the Witch King. And so Rhudaur was very much a puppet state of Angmar by the time of Argaleb I. So in defence to Rhudaur's resistance, and indeed the threat of Angmar, Argaleb fortifies the Weather Hills, and Arthedain and Cardolan now stand together against Rhudaur in what is very soon to be open war. Argaleb indeed was then slain in battle with Rhudaur, defending the very hills he fortified in the year 1356. So after about 50 years of unease, war is now starting to really break out, and Rhudaur is openly in rebellion against Arthedain. Whereas before the three kingdoms had border skirmishes and disagreements, they are now at war. Lindon at this time gives aid to the southwestern realms, and Arveleg, who has come to power in the death of his father, Argeleb. And indeed, the Weather Hills are defended again, and the Lower Horwell and the Great Road now mark the boundary of the Free Peoples and the boundary of Ruidour. With the Horwell, of course, the Lower Horwell being a river, and the Great Road running east to west. Also at this time, no unrelated to the men of Arthedain or Cardlan, but Angmar and Ruidour now besiege Rivendell. But in 1409, a host of Angmar finally makes its mark on the world, and whilst they are besieging Imladris, an army of Angmar finally takes Amun Sul. So, only 100 years ago, the stirrings of war were on the lips of those of Arthedain and Cardlan. Ruidour was protesting against the Argeleb's claim for the throne, and then within only 100 years, they've gone to war with one of the successor kingdoms, and Angmar has now reared its head and made its mark, and Amun Sul is destroyed. Arveleg is slain in the defence of the Great Tower, but the Palantir manages to escape and is taken to Fornost. Ruidour now is occupied outright by Angmar. There is no question on anyone's mind anymore. Angmar owns and controls Ruidour, and the Hillmen have signed allegiance to the Witch King. The Dunedain that remained in Ruidour were either slain or managed to escape, but the Eastern Realm is now entirely lost, and the situation has turned bleak indeed for the children of Arnor. Cardlan was then ravaged at this time as well. With the fall of the Weather Hills and the taking of Amun Sul, there is now no blocker from Angmar straight into Cardlan, using Ruidour as their road. And Cardlan is pillaged, plundered, and raided constantly. However, it is not conquered. And despite his youth, King Arafor, the son of Arveleg, with Círdan's help, now repels Angmar from the North Downs, and manages to hold on to some semblance of order and control in Cardlan, with a great victory over the forces of Angmar. A remnant of the faithful Dunedain also hold out in the Old Forest and at Turin Gorthad, which is the Barrow Downs. However, unfortunately for Cardlan, the war, they just simply cannot hold out forever. And the last prince of Cardlan finally dies at this time, unnamed though he is, and Cardlan becomes a barren wasteland. The faithful that remained and were able to hold at the Old Forest and to hold on the Barrow Downs, and after the great victory of Arafor, they all pull back to Arthedain, and Cardlan, as I say, becomes abandoned. However, at this time, the fortunes of Arnor then turn for a time, as Lyndon and Elrond of Rivendell are able to help and to subdue Angmar. Elrond comes with help from Lorien, where, of course, his wife's parents reside. And they are able to push back Angmar for a time. So Angmar retreats north, and a great peace reigns. For around 220 years, the nation of Arthedain is blessedly at peace and is able to rebuild and prepare for anything that might come. But of course, Cardlan is not repaired at this time. Some people do still live there, I should say. They're not outright abandoned yet. But they no longer have their own independent ruler, and they are now, for all intents and purposes, just a small and lightly populated region of Arthedain. Because after the 226 years of peace, the Great Plague comes to Eriador. It came up from the southeast, where it had already ravaged the lands of Gondor and Calanathan and Enedwaith, and it makes its way through Cardlan and up to Bree and beyond. But the cold, frozen land of the north kills off the plague, and so Arthedain is mostly spared. But the same cannot be said for Cardlan, and it is utterly devastated. The few who remained and survived the war with Angmar now have no hope but to either flee north to Arthedain or meet the end. And of course, faced with those conditions, those that can flee, but many are killed. The Great Plague kills thousands, if not hundreds of thousands in its time, not just in Cardlan, I mean the entire world. There is always theory that the Great Plague is brought about by Sauron or by the Witch King's power, but in all of the readings I've done, as far as I can see, the Great Plague is entirely a natural occurrence, and just damn bad luck, really. Now, as I say, Arthedain is mostly spared because the plague is killed out in the cold, frozen northern land, so Rhuideau and Angmar are also spared, but southern Arthedain is affected, and so Arthedain's borders now are very much in practice, de facto, is really just Fornost and the lands around it. Whereas in the past, Arthedain being the largest of the three successor kingdoms, it stretched from the ice bay of Foreshell down to the spurs of the southern Blue Mountains. And now all it is really is a great capital city and the lands around it, as people flood to Fornost for defence and for safety. Shortly after the coming of the Great Plague, the Witch King seizes on this opportunity, and something we know he definitely does do, is the evil spirits come to the Barrow Downs. Now, these come from Rhuideau and from Angmar, and they take up residence in Cardland specifically, but more located, as we all know, in the burial mounds of the Barrow Downs, Turin Gorthad. And this is the final nail in the coffin of Cardland. Any hardy would-be resistors who held off after the wars, held off after the plague, they now abandon Cardland altogether. And it is now, with the coming of the spirits for the burial mounds of Turin Gorthad, that Cardland becomes a wasteland. Despite this fall of Cardland, however, Arthedain endures for another 338 years. This small successor kingdom, now up against two nations and having lost one of its own allies, stands for another 300 years. But finally, in the year 1974 of the Third Age, a year many of you, of course, will know very well, a great host finally comes out of Angmar. So far, the war with Angmar has been marked by, again, border skirmishes and one or two key battles, such as the battle where Arathor wins victory at the North Downs. But overall, the war with Angmar is very much a very long, drawn-out, constant state of war, but with very little actually taking place. There are few battles of note, there are constant skirmishes, but land doesn't really trade hands. The Angmarim do manage to destroy, obviously, the Amunsul and the Weather Hills, and they take those. They capture Rhuideau, but not through military success, but through diplomacy, essentially. And Cardland falls primarily to the Great Plague and not really to Angmar. Angmar, of course, is an act in the causation link of Cardland's destruction. But the Plague is the real nail in the coffin. And Arthedain doesn't really lose any land. People are obviously abandoning parts of Arthedain and flooding to the capital, but Angmar doesn't then claim those lands. It is not a war of conquest, I should say. It is a war of annihilation. Angmar's goal is extermination. They don't care about what lands Arthedain hold. They care about its people, and they want them dead. So the war just rolls on and rolls on and rolls on with very little actually happening. It's marked by key external events, the Great Plague, the coming of the evil spirits to the Barrow Downs, Rhuideau siding with Angmar, but it's not marked by great battles until the final one. And I just think that's quite interesting. It's not a really great war. It's just a slow burning war with then one ultimate battle. I just think that's it's quite different, considering other conquests of Middle-earth are marked by just constant key battles and major warfare. But anyway, the 19th and 74th, the 1974th year of the Third Age. So we're talking at the moment roughly 1,000 years before the events of the War of the Ring. The great host of Angmar comes down from the north, led by the Witch King himself. And in a desperate last battle, the Dunedain defend the walls of Fornost. But they are defeated. We know very little about the actual Battle of Fornost. Unfortunately, for example, in the First Age, the battles and wars of Gondolin, or indeed the war for Gondolin, the defence of Gondolin, is written about quite extensively by Tolkien, and we know about various key events from key elven fighters and sections of the city falling and how the overall battle plays out. But Fornost, we only know that the Dunedain defend the walls and they lose. And the Witch King and his band of evil men and evil orcs then raids the city. Now, they don't outright destroy it. It isn't absolutely sacked and burnt to the ground. Like, this isn't a Rome-Carthage situation. It is just the people, again, are just killed or flee. The town is ruined, and obviously some damage is felt to the town. It's a battle, for example, but it isn't utterly destroyed. So the ruins of Fornost endure, but obviously at this time, the great loss of Arthedain is felt at the Battle of Fornost. The king, Arvedui, eventually manages to flee to the north, though, and he takes the Palantir with him. At this time, he held the North Downs for a little while after Fornost fell. Now, the North Downs, I don't know if I've got a map up this time, but the North Downs are the downs directly north of Fornost. They're not related to the Barrow Downs. They're a different location. And so whilst Fornost fell, the North Downs held on for a little while longer, giving the time for the king to escape. Now, Arvedui is rather famous for the meaning of his name, because his name means last king. And he was the subject of a great prophecy from a very prophetic man, Malbeth the Seer. And he prophesied that should the Dunedain have taken a path that seemed the less hopeful, then Arvedui would have changed his name and ruled over a great realm. If, however, they do not take the path that seems less hopeful, then Arvedui and the Dunedain will fall, and many Dunedain would perish. Now, no one really knew what this prophecy meant, and of course it was made at the time of Arvedui's birth, not long into his reign, and he was named the last king, which in itself is such foreshadowing. But as I say, Malbeth says, yes, he's called the last king, but if he does something that seems hopeless, he will actually turn it around, he'll change his name and rule over a great realm. And that choice presents itself to Arvedui in the Ice Bay of Foreshell. Now, interestingly, before Arvedui makes his way all the way north to the Ice Bay, he actually goes to the Blue Mountains and spends a time in dwarven mines there. And this is one of those odd plot holes where you really want to talk to Tolkien, because Arvedui and his company, they make it to the Blue Mountains, so why then do they not just go south to Lindon? What makes them go east to the Ice Bay of Foreshell? I don't understand, and I couldn't find an answer to that question. So if anyone has an answer to that question, I'd love to hear it. But because it seems to me, if you've made it to the Blue Mountains, you've already more than 50% of the way to Lindon, who are your own allies. Why not just go that little bit further? And it doesn't say anywhere that Angmar had taken the lands of the Lune, which is just the land to the north of Mithlond. So there's nothing stopping him heading south. I don't know if he couldn't make the journey, for example, I suppose is probably the most likely, and that they run out of food, which is the reason why they leave the mines behind in the first place. And so I suppose if they don't have food, they don't want to risk that they might not find food on the journey south, although surely there'd be deer and things like that. I don't know. Anyway, this is a tangent. I don't understand why Arvedui goes east and not south, is the point of the story. So anyway, after dwelling in the abandoned mines of the northeast of Ered Luin, hunger forces him to seek aid from the Losoth. These are the people of Foreshell. The Losoth are almost exactly based on Inuit culture. So they live and they dwell in ice huts, and they fish on the frozen sea in the north. They are absolutely terrified of the weapons that Arvedui and his company bring. So these people are not accustomed to war or battle at all, and they are completely separate to everything that has gone on before. They are totally independent from the events and times of the period of Middle-earth. Now, they are separate, but that doesn't mean they've not heard of the Witch King, and initially when Arvedui arrives in their company, they don't want to help him because they fear the Witch King. And they fear specifically the Witch King's ability to bring an almost eternal winter. They see him as this sort of, from my understanding and my reading, he's sort of like the evil spirit of winter to them, in that he can bring great frozen death upon them at any time. And they don't want to risk his ire, so they don't wish to help Arvedui. But a combination of pity, seeing these bedraggled, just absolutely distraught men, and fear of the great weapons that they have on their belts, the Losoth help the king. Now, in time, the king's son Aranarth makes his way to Círdan in Lindon and asks for aid. He explains his father's plight. He says, "My father is trapped in the frozen north with the Losoth, and we can't get him down here. He's got the Palantir with him, he's got a number of men with him, and he, of course, is the king. Can you help?" Círdan at once sends a ship north, right round the spur of Ered Luin, and into the Ice Bay itself, and it comes to the Losoth. And then this is the choice that Arvedui has to make. The Losoth counsel the king, and they say to him, do not board this sea monster, because they've not seen ships before. They have canoes and whatnot, but they don't know of these great sea-going vessels. And they say, don't board this sea monster. The Witch King's power is strongest in the winter, but the summer will come. His power will wane, and you will be able to make the safe journey on land to Linden. We will give you the supplies and food you need, but don't board that sea monster at the moment, at the height of the Witch King's power. Arvedui ignores them, feeling that being trapped with the Losoth right on the borders of the Witch King's realm is indeed the lesser of two evils, or the greater of two evils, and that to board the ship is the path of hope. And he boards, and many of you, of course, will know what happens next. For Arvedui, the Ring of Barahir. Arvedui gives the Ring of Barahir, no link there whatsoever. But in payment for what the Losoth have done to him, he gives the Ring of Barahir to them before boarding the ship. Shortly after the ship sails away from the village of the Losoth, it sinks beneath the sea. Caught in either a storm, turbulent winds sent by the Witch King, hit by icebergs, who knows what. But the ship sinks. It takes everybody on board with it, including the Palantir of the North. 2 Palantir, I believe, indeed. Fornost, or Anuminas' Palantir, and Amunsul's, leaving only the Tower Hills to have a Palantir in the north. Arvedui is killed. He lives up to his name, and the prophecy comes true for the worse. Because with the death of Arvedui and the death of their last king, the Dunedain and the realm of Arnor are finally defeated. Aranath, the son of Arvedui, refuses to take up the title of king, for he has no kingdom to rule over, and he becomes the first chieftain of the Dunedain. The Dunedain are now utterly scattered, and they do not have the strength in them to fight any further. Many of them will now seek refuge in the lands of Linden and Imladris, because the Witch King, of course, is still rampant in the north, and who knows what his plans are next. However, as we shall read and hear about in the next episode, this one's slightly shorter, but someone comes 1 year after the fall of Fornost and shortly after the death of Arvedui, or indeed in the same year as the death of Arvedui. Glorfindel of Linden comes to the aid of Arnor with the forces of Gondor. And that is the subject of our next episode. So that ends this one. I do hope you've enjoyed this little recap of the events of Arnor, indeed. If I may this time, as I didn't have anyone to thank for... I thank all of the people that support me on Patreon, of course, but there were no specific High Marshal, Banner Marshal ranks this time. Something just to reply to a comment that I had seen is that, yes, if you were to read any of the Lord of the Rings books and any of the wider material, you can learn all of this for yourself. But the point of these videos is to try and pull information from various different books into a single place and just explain the narrative in an almost audiobook style of fashion. So I appreciate fully that many people that listen to this will know the story of Arnor, and you may know what's going to come next with Gondor and all of that. But for many who have only read sort of The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, The Return of the King, or indeed The Lord of the Rings, they may not know any of this, and they may be surprised to learn it. And it's just about bringing information together and attempting to just read, or essentially, or explain periods of Middle-earth's history that are otherwise not as easily accessible if you have only read the base book. So that was the reply to that question. But for now, that'll be all. So thank you very much for listening, if indeed you have. And until we speak again, dear friends, Navar Naden Peremat Melonin, and farewell.